The smell of lilies filled the small country church as we laid Grandpa Joe to rest. I sat in the front pew, watching the mahogany casket that held the man who'd raised me after my parents died in that car accident when I was 12. 23 years had passed since then, and Grandpa had been my anchor, my teacher, my everything. After the service, as people gathered at the farmhouse sharing stories and casseroles, my cousin Derek cornered me by the kitchen window. His expensive suit looked out of place among the flannel shirts and worn dresses of our rural community. "Just so you know, Marcus, the farm's mine now," he said, adjusting his silk tie. Grandpa left everything to me in his will. I nearly choked on my coffee. Derek hadn't visited the farm in over 5 years, not since he'd moved to the city and started his real estate business. Meanwhile, I'd been here every weekend, helping Grandpa with the crops, fixing fences, and listening to his stories about the old days. "That can't be right," I managed to say. Derek pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket. "It's all legal, signed and notarized last month." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm planning to sell to developers. This land's worth a fortune now that the city's expanding." My heart sank. The thought of bulldozers tearing down the barn where Grandpa taught me to whittle, destroying the fields where we'd walked every evening, felt like losing him all over again. "I just want to visit the barn one last time," I said quietly. "To say goodbye properly." Derek shrugged. "Fine, but make it quick. I'm meeting with contractors next week." Chapter 2. Memories in Wood and Stone. 300 words. The next morning, I drove my old pickup truck down the familiar gravel road to the farm. The autumn air was crisp, and the maple trees lining the driveway had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold. Everything looked exactly as it had when Grandpa was alive. Yet it felt completely different knowing I'd never see him emerge from the barn with hay in his hair and that gentle smile on his weathered face. I parked near the farmhouse and walked slowly toward the barn. It was a massive structure, built by my great-grandfather in 1923, with timber from the property's own oak trees. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, and some of the boards had warped with age, but it was still solid and proud. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the high windows. The familiar scent of hay, old leather, and motor oil enveloped me like a warm embrace. This was where Grandpa had taught me to drive the tractor when my feet could barely reach the pedals, where we'd spent countless hours repairing equipment and talking about life. I ran my hand along the workbench where his tools still lay scattered, the same tools he'd inherited from his father. Above the bench hung the old family photos he'd moved here after Grandma died, saying the barn felt too empty without some family watching over his work. The photos showed generations of our family working this land. My great-great-grandfather breaking ground with a horse-drawn plow. My great-grandfather building this very barn. Grandpa as a young man, standing proudly next to his first tractor. How could Derek just sell all of this history? How could Grandpa have left it to someone who saw only dollar signs where we saw legacy? Chapter 3. The Hidden Corner. 300 words. As I wandered through the barn, touching familiar objects and remembering shared moments, I noticed something I'd never seen before. In the far corner, behind an old hay baler that hadn't been moved in years, there was a small wooden chest partially hidden under a canvas tarp. My curiosity piqued. I carefully moved the heavy equipment aside. The chest was made of the same oak as the barn, with intricate carvings along its edges that matched the craftsmanship of the building itself. A small brass nameplate on the lid was tarnished with age, but I could make out the words, Joseph William Thompson, Grandpa's full name. The chest wasn't locked, but the hinges creaked with age as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were dozens of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be legal papers. My hands trembled as I lifted out the first bundle. The photographs were older than any I'd seen before, showing the farm in its earliest days. But it was the documents that made my breath catch. Land deeds, property surveys, and correspondence dating back to the 1800s. As I carefully unfolded the papers, a pattern began to emerge that made my heart race. These weren't just random family documents. They were proof of something much more significant. The original land grant, signed by territorial officials, clearly showed the property boundaries. But more importantly, there was a will. Not Grandpa's, but his father's will from 1967. I read it twice to make sure I understood correctly. According to this document, the farm wasn't supposed to go to the eldest son, as family tradition might suggest. Instead, it was to be passed down to whoever showed the greatest commitment to preserving the family legacy and working the land. The implications hit me like a thunderbolt. Chapter 4, Grandfather's Secret, 300 words. Among the papers, I found a leather-bound journal with Grandpa's handwriting. The entries were dated over the past several months, and as I read them, I realized he'd been planning something important before his death. March 15th. Derek visited today. First time in 2 years. Spent the whole time talking about selling the farm for development. Broke my heart to hear him speak of our family's legacy like it was just another business transaction. April 2nd. Marcus helped me repair the south fence today. Watched him work with the same care his great-grandfather would have shown. He understands this land, respects it. He's the one who should inherit this place. May 20th. Spoke with Lawyer Johnson about changing my will. Derek won't understand, but this farm needs someone who loves it, not someone who sees it as a commodity. My hands shook as I continued reading. Entry after entry detailed Grandpa's growing certainty that I should inherit the farm, not Derek. But the final entries, dated just weeks before his death, revealed something troubling. June 30th, Derek showed up unexpectedly today with some legal papers. Said he needed me to sign some documents for estate planning. I was feeling poorly and didn't read them carefully. Now I'm worried I may have made a terrible mistake. July 15th. Tried to reach Lawyer Johnson, but Derek said he'd handle everything. Something doesn't feel right. I've hidden the real will and all the important documents in the old chest behind the hay baler. If something happens to me, I pray Marcus will find them. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Grandpa's heart attack. July 18th. Derek keeps pressuring me about those papers. I think he tricked me into signing something I shouldn't have. God forgive me. Chapter 5. The Real Will. 300 words. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture, I found what I was looking for. Grandpa's real will, dated just 2 months before his death and properly notarized by Lawyer Johnson. The document was crystal clear. The farm, all 200 acres of it, along with the house, barn, and all equipment, was left to me. Not Derek, me, but there was more. Attached to the will was a letter in Grandpa's careful handwriting, addressed to me personally. "My dear Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to prevent me from giving you this will directly. I fear Derek may have manipulated me into signing false documents, taking advantage of my illness and confusion in my final weeks." The letter went on to explain how Derek had visited repeatedly in those last months, always with papers to sign, always claiming they were just routine estate planning documents. Grandpa had grown suspicious but felt too weak and confused to fight back effectively. "You are the rightful heir to this farm," the letter continued, "not because of blood or birth order, but because you understand what this place means. You've worked this soil with your own hands, you've cared for the animals, you've preserved the traditions that make this more than just property." Grandpa had also included detailed instructions about where to find additional evidence of Derek's deception, including recordings he'd made on his old cassette player when Derek thought he was sleeping. As I held the real will in my hands, I felt a mixture of relief, anger, and determination. Grandpa had tried to protect our family's legacy, even in his final days. Now it was up to me to honor his wishes and expose Derek's fraud. But I knew Derek wouldn't give up without a fight. Chapter 6. Evidence Everywhere. 300 words. Following Grandpa's instructions, I searched the barn more thoroughly and found additional evidence hidden in various locations. Behind a loose board in the tack room, I discovered a small digital recorder. Apparently, Grandpa had been more tech-savvy than any of us realized. I pressed play with trembling fingers. Derek's voice filled the quiet barn. "Just sign here, Grandpa Joe. It's just updating your insurance beneficiaries. Nothing major." Then Grandpa's weaker voice. "I don't understand why this is necessary, Derek. I already have a will. This supersedes that old thing. Trust me, I'm looking out for the family's best interests." There were several recordings, each one showing Derek's manipulation becoming more aggressive. In the final recording, made just days before Grandpa's death, Derek's true nature was fully revealed. "Look, old man, you're not thinking clearly anymore. Just sign the papers and let me handle everything. Marcus doesn't have the business sense to manage this property. I can turn this place into millions. This farm isn't about money, Derek. It's about family, about tradition. Tradition doesn't pay bills. Sign the papers or I'll have you declared mentally incompetent." The recording ended abruptly, but it was enough. Combined with the real will and the other documents, I had everything I needed to prove Derek's fraud. I carefully gathered all the evidence, photographing each document with my phone as backup. As I worked, I thought about Grandpa's final weeks, how he must have felt so alone and confused, being pressured by someone he trusted. But he'd been clever enough to hide the truth, banking on the fact that I would eventually come to the barn, our special place, and discover what he'd left for me. Now I had to decide how to use this evidence. Chapter 7. Confronting the Truth. 300 words. I drove straight to Derek's hotel in town, the evidence burning like fire in my backpack. I found him in the restaurant, having lunch with two men in expensive suits, probably the developers he'd mentioned. "Marcus," he said, looking surprised and annoyed. "I thought you'd said your goodbyes yesterday. We need to talk, privately." Derek excused himself from his companions and followed me to a quiet corner of the lobby. I pulled out my phone and played one of Grandpa's recordings. The color drained from Derek's face as his own voice filled the space between us, clearly demonstrating his manipulation and fraud. "Where did you find that?" he whispered. "Grandpa was smarter than you gave him credit for," I said, pulling out copies of the real will. "He knew what you were doing, and he made sure the truth would come out." Derek's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand, Marcus. This farm is sitting on a gold mine. The developers are offering $12 million. $12 million! We could split it, be set for life. It's not about the money, Derek. It never was. Everything's about money," he hissed. "That old man was living in the past, clinging to some romantic notion about family legacy. This is the real world." I stood up, shouldering my backpack. "I'm taking this evidence to Lawyer Johnson and the sheriff. You have until tomorrow morning to withdraw your fraudulent claim and return any documents you stole from Grandpa." Derek grabbed my arm. "Wait, we can work something out. I'll give you a cut of the sale." I pulled free from his grip. "The farm isn't for sale, Derek. It never will be." As I walked away, I heard him calling after me, but I didn't look back. Chapter 8. Legal Vindication. 300 words. Lawyer Johnson's office was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits with Grandpa, wood-paneled walls lined with law books and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. Johnson himself was in his 70s now, but his mind was still sharp as a tack. "Marcus," he said, rising from behind his massive oak desk, "I've been expecting you." I spread the evidence across his desk, the real will, the recordings, the photographs, and all the supporting documents. Johnson examined each piece carefully, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of approval. "Your grandfather came to see me about 6 months ago," he said finally. "He was worried about Derek's intentions and wanted to make sure his true wishes were legally protected. We prepared this will together, and I advised him to hide copies in case something happened. So you knew about Derek's fraud. I suspected it when Derek presented that other will for probate. The language was wrong. The notarization looked suspicious, and frankly, it didn't match anything Joe had ever told me about his intentions." Johnson leaned back in his chair. "But without proof, my hands were tied." He picked up one of the recording. "This changes everything. We have clear evidence of elder abuse, fraud, and coercion. Derek could face serious criminal charges." Within hours, Johnson had filed the necessary paperwork to challenge Derek's fraudulent will and submitted the evidence to the district attorney's office. The sheriff was notified, and a warrant was issued for Derek's arrest. "The farm is yours, Marcus," Johnson said as we finished the paperwork. "It always was, according to your grandfather's true wishes. Derek's claim is completely invalid." As I drove back to the farm that evening, I felt Grandpa's presence with me, as if he were sitting in the passenger seat, smiling with satisfaction. Chapter 9. Derek's Downfall. 300 words. The next morning, I was feeding the chickens when I saw the sheriff's car pull into the driveway, followed by Derek's rental car. Through the kitchen window, I watched as Deputy Martinez approached Derek with handcuffs. Derek saw me watching and his face twisted with rage. He broke free from the deputy and stormed toward me. "You've ruined everything," he shouted. "That farm should be mine. I'm the eldest grandson." "Being the eldest doesn't make you the most deserving," I replied calmly. "Grandpa left the farm to someone who would love and protect it, not exploit it." Deputy Martinez caught up and firmly placed Derek in handcuffs. "Derek Thompson, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, and forgery." As they read him his rights, Derek continued his tirade. "You have no idea what you're giving up, Marcus. $12 million. We could have been rich." "I am rich," I said. "I have 200 acres of the most beautiful land in the county, a home filled with memories, and the knowledge that I'm preserving something meaningful for future generations." The developers Derek had been meeting with drove up just as the sheriff's car was leaving. I walked over to their expensive sedan and leaned down to the driver's window. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This property is not for sale, and it never will be." The lead developer, a thin man with calculating eyes, tried to change my mind. "Son, we're prepared to offer $15 million for this property. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. This land isn't measured in dollars," I said. "It's measured in generations. Good day, gentlemen." They drove away, leaving me alone with my inheritance and my memories. Chapter 10. Restoring the Legacy. 300 words. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into restoring the farm to its former glory. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Derek's fraud was so obvious that he eventually pled guilty to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. He was ordered to pay restitution and serve 2 years in county jail. I started with the barn, the heart of the operation. I replaced the worn boards, repainted the exterior in the traditional red that Grandpa had always preferred, and organized all the tools and equipment. Every morning I'd stand in the doorway and remember the countless hours Grandpa and I had spent here together. The farmhouse needed work, too. I repaired the front porch where Grandpa used to sit in his rocking chair every evening, watching the sunset over his fields. I restored the kitchen where he'd taught me to make his famous buttermilk biscuits, and I set up the spare bedroom exactly as it had been when I was a child. Neighbors began stopping by, offering help and sharing their own memories of Grandpa. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent farm brought over a casserole and told me how proud Grandpa had been of me in his final years. "He used to say you were the only one who truly understood what this place meant," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "He knew you'd take care of it properly." I planted a vegetable garden using Grandpa's heirloom seeds, the same varieties his grandfather had brought from Ireland over a century ago. As I worked the soil with my hands, I felt connected to all the generations who had worked this same earth before me. The farm was coming back to life, and with it, I was finding my true purpose. Chapter 11. New Beginnings. 300 words. 6 months after inheriting the farm, I had established a routine that honored both tradition and progress. I kept the core agricultural operations that Grandpa had loved, growing corn, soybeans, and maintaining a small herd of cattle. But I also introduced sustainable farming practices and started a small organic vegetable operation that supplied local restaurants. The barn had become more than just a storage facility. I'd converted part of it into a workshop where I taught woodworking classes to local kids, passing on the skills Grandpa had taught me. Every Saturday morning, a dozen children would gather around the same workbench where I'd learned to whittle, their eager faces reminding me of my own childhood wonder. I also started hosting farm tours for school groups, showing them how food is grown and teaching them about agricultural history. The old family photos that Grandpa had hung in the barn became conversation starters, helping children understand the connection between past and present. One afternoon, while I was teaching a young girl how to properly hold a chisel, she looked up at me with serious eyes. "Mr. Marcus, why is this farm so special to you?" I paused, considering how to explain something so profound to a 10-year-old. "Because it's not just land," I said finally. "It's a story that's been written by my family for over 100 years. Every tree, every building, every field has memories in it. When I take care of this place, I'm taking care of all those memories too." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood perfectly. That evening, as I sat on the front porch watching the sunset, I felt Grandpa's presence more strongly than ever. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Chapter 12, Full Circle, 300 Words. A year later, the farm was thriving in ways I'd never imagined. The sustainable practices I'd implemented had increased crop yields while reducing environmental impact. The educational programs had grown so popular that I'd had to hire an assistant to help manage the tours and workshops. But the most meaningful change was personal. I'd met Sarah, a veterinarian who'd come to check on one of my cattle and ended up staying for dinner. She shared my love of rural life and understood the importance of preserving agricultural traditions. We'd been talking about marriage and the possibility of raising a family on the farm. One evening, as we walked through the barn together, Sarah stopped at the workbench where Grandpa's tools still hung. "He would have loved you," I said, wrapping my arms around her from behind. "I wish I could have met him," she replied, leaning back against my chest. "From everything you've told me, he sounds like an amazing man." He was, and he would have been so happy to know that the farm will continue into another generation. We stood there in comfortable silence, surrounded by the tools and memories of generations past, planning for the generations to come. The barn that had once hidden the truth about my inheritance had become the foundation for my future. Later that night, I found myself back in the barn alone, running my hands over the old chest where I'd discovered Grandpa's secret. I whispered a quiet thank you to the darkness, knowing somehow that he could hear me. The farm was more than just my inheritance now. It was my responsibility, my passion, and my gift to the future. Grandpa's legacy was secure, and the story would continue. Chapter 13, Forever Home, 300 Words. 2 years after that day in the barn, Sarah and I were married in a simple ceremony held right here on the farm. We exchanged vows under the old oak tree where Grandpa used to sit and watch the sunset, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and the rolling hills that had witnessed generations of love and loss. Derek was released from jail that spring, but never contacted me. I heard through family friends that he'd moved to another state and started over in a different line of work. I hoped he'd learned something from his experience, though I doubted our paths would cross again. The farm continued to prosper. We'd added a small bed and breakfast operation in the renovated farmhouse, welcoming visitors who wanted to experience authentic rural life. Guests often commented on the sense of peace and history that seemed to permeate every corner of the property. Sarah was pregnant with our first child, and we'd already decided that regardless of gender, the baby would grow up learning the same lessons Grandpa had taught me: respect for the land, appreciation for hard work, and understanding that some things are more valuable than money. As I write this final chapter, I'm sitting in the barn at Grandpa's old workbench. The tools he used, the photos he treasured, and the wisdom he shared all remain here, waiting to be passed down to another generation. The developers still call occasionally, offering increasingly ridiculous sums for the property. I always give them the same answer: this land is not for sale. It never will be. Some legacies can't be bought or sold. They can only be lived, protected, and passed on with love. This farm is my forever home, just as Grandpa always intended. Thank you so much for listening to this story about family, legacy, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. I hope it reminded you that the most valuable inheritances aren't always measured in dollars, but in love, memories, and the responsibility to preserve something meaningful for future generations. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if you have any family stories about inheritance, farms, or discovering hidden truths. Your stories inspire the content I create. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about family mysteries, rural life, and the unexpected discoveries that can change everything. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, and thank you again for being part of our storytelling community. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important treasures are hidden in the places that hold our deepest memories.